I'm Adam Weiner. I'm the chair of the Russian department. And thank you. And I'm your MC this evening. I'm delighted to see you all here. And it's great to see such a turnout on such a soupy evening. So glad you made it. I'm eager to introduce tonight's speakers. And so also to launch another extravaganza of extracurricular activities for the 2017-2018 academic year in Russian area studies. So I'm going to present tonight's speakers in the order that they will present, and then I'll have a little announcement after that, and we'll start our panel. Jason Cieply is a visiting professor in Russian. He's teaching courses here on Russian fiction, political thought, and film. He's currently writing a book about the emotional experience of revolution as reflected in the experimental early writings of the Soviet Union. He's also interested in contemporary Russian culture and has been writing about a group of young, politically engaged artists and intellectuals based in St. Petersburg. He's in the front row here, and you'll hear from him very soon. Today, Jason is going to introduce you to Roman Osminkin, who is a poet, performance artist, and rising star on the Russian cultural scene. Jason will show how Osminkin has drawn upon the aesthetic program of the infamous deceased conceptualist poet Dmitry Prigov in order to create his own unique, evocative style. After Jason, Professor Nina Tumarkin will speak. Nina is Catherine Wasserman Davis Professor of Slavic Studies at Wellesley College and an historian of Russia. Her published books are The Living and the Dead, The Rise and Fall of the Cult of World War II in Russia, and Lenin Lives, The Lenin Cult in Soviet Russia. Her current book project is Politics of the Past in Putin's Russia. And tonight, Nina is going to talk to us about the current symbolic politics we see in Russia and tell us whether Russia's leader is going to maintain his image as the macho Putin or switch over to Dedushka Putin, Grandpa Putin. She will also discourse on current monumental politics. Our last presenter will be Igor Logvinenko, who is our political scientist here at Wellesley College. Igor's research explores the consequences of financial globalization in Russia and other post-communist countries. He is working on a book right now called Control and Access, Financial Openness and Authoritarian Politics in Russia. Igor will be talking tonight about the oligarchs and silovarchs and the role of Western financial system in Russian politics. We can also expect a few words from him about the state of the Russian economy and some comments on the Trump-Russia investigation. Let me take a moment right now to add that with tonight's panel, we launched the Russian Area Studies program of extracurricular events, concerts, lectures, and other happenings. It's going to be yet another year of ear and eye-popping lectures and concerts. But this is no ordinary year. For coming in November, really October, we will be witnessing the passing of 1 century since the Russian Revolution of 1917. We therefore have only a few weeks left to figure out what on earth happened there and whether we need to worry about it happening again anytime soon. Here at the college, we will, of course, commemorate this event with our own lecture. So please keep your eyes peeled for fascinating events brought to you by the Russian Area Studies program. To wit, there will be a concert called Secrets of the Russian Gypsy Guitar. This is a concert by Russian guitar duo Zingaryaska on October 3rd at 7 o'clock in the Jewett Auditorium. There's going to be a lecture a double lecture called Russian-U.S. Relations, What Next? On October 4th at 8 o'clock p.m. And this is by Professor Angela Stent and Dr. Lilia Shevtsova. And then on October 25th, we'll have a lecture called What the Bolsheviks Seized When They Seized Power by Professor William Rosenberg. This is at 8 o'clock p.m., venue to be announced. And speaking of what the Bolsheviks seized, and also to give you a foretaste of Jason's subject matter, I cannot refrain from reading one of my own favorite Prigov poems in my own humble translation. It goes something like this. Ahem. A banal discourse on the theme of the firm foundations of life. I've touched eucalyptus's leaves, the fringe of a banner I've touched. And I've touched in a different meaning, at times, people's minds and their hearts. But life, you alas cannot build on the touching of various things. Just remember the rule. Fine, you've touched it. Now put it back where it belongs. That said, please hold your questions until all of our three panelists have spoken, and then feel free to ask the questions that you have of any of them. And now I happily yield up the floor to our first panelist, Jason.
So, how do we trigger the old projector? Oh, that's the thing I was supposed to. It was image muting. I thought it was audio muting. You told me that. Yeah, okay, so today I want to introduce you to someone who I think is one of the most interesting poets to come out of contemporary Russia. One of the things I think is so remarkable about this person, Roman Asminkin, is the astounding variety of creative and intellectual production that for him go into being a poet. Asminkin is also a performance artist, a leftist activist, a video artist, an essayist, a rapper, a dancer, an art critic, a graduate student in art history, an ethnographer of the communal apartment, a graffiti artist, a curator, an avid Facebook poster, and I think adept theorist of new media technology. He's toured America recently. He's self-ironically described himself as a campus poet, and he's made the circuit of Ivy League schools. And he's also, last year he had a sort of parallel translation come out in a sort of small independent press called Cicada. And this year he has a new edition of translations coming out at N+1, so you can look forward to that. I'm writing the preface and some translations for it. But he's getting a lot of attention, and some people think for better, some people think it's for worse. But in today's talk, I want to give you some context for his work. First, the immediate context of a small community of artists from which he emerged in Petersburg. And second, the broader context of the artists and thinkers from the early and late Soviet avant-garde from whom he has drawn inspiration. In this section, I'll focus on one poet in particular, and the one who's influenced him, I think, the most profoundly, that is Dmitry Prigov. Then I will go on to show you some of Asminkin's work in the short time that I'll have left, and to tell you why I think he's important for Russia and maybe for us as well. So Asminkin comes from a group of poets, artists, critics, and activists united around a literary journal called Translit. Translit is an independently produced journal of poetry and literary theory based in Petersburg and founded by Asminkin and a friend of his. Those are the photos I wanted to show you of Asminkin before and all of his diverse roles and personalities. This is Translit. And his friend, the chief editor, Pavel Arseniev, who's also a poet and an installation artist and kind of, I think, one of the main curators of the contemporary art scene in Petersburg and Moscow and beyond into the regions. Translit regularly publishes new translations of Western theory alongside their own poetry and manifestos. In this way, the journal serves as a major stimulus to new ideas in the world of Russian art and political theory. Translit-affiliated artists like Asminkin share an interest in protest art and politically engaged performance geared towards transforming public spaces. A core ambition of the group is to resist the alienation they believe to be ubiquitous in modern society. They aim to do this by working at the level of language, by shaking people out of their ordinary lives and customary modes of social interaction. They seek to cultivate a collectivist way of being in society, new ways of interacting with people, objects, the city, that would be free of the violence and alienation. Many of these ideas they took from the Soviet avant-garde, but their hope is to realize these utopian dreams, or at least further their cause, while avoiding the totalitarianism that subsumed Stalinist society. To this end, they also draw on the practices of the late Soviet avant-garde, especially the conceptualist poets like Dmitry Prigov. In the second half of the 20th century, conceptualist artists and critics advanced a critique of their predecessors in the early Soviet avant-garde. The conceptualists alleged that despite the Soviet avant-garde's best intentions of freeing ordinary people from the alienating experience of mundane everyday life, the notion that we can or should strive to radically transform human consciousness for the better and to re-engineer language to facilitate these transformations implied an inherently totalitarian logic. Moreover, these conceptualists argued, these grandiose avant-garde visions of total transformation led directly to Stalin himself. Stalin, they argued, was the ultimate avant-garde artist, and his creation was the Soviet Union, sort of prison for the mind. Thus, in their artistic practices, the conceptualists aimed to debunk and dismantle the language of Soviet ideology, to discover the root of totalitarianism in language itself, and in the ways in which we as individuals construct our own identities, the ways we imagine ourselves to be whole, finite, and coherent, when really we are made of intangible and dispersed fragments of language and behavioral models. To use the conceptualist's dominant metaphor, the self was something which shimmered and could not be pinned down. And when we operate under the assumption that we can pin ourselves down in language, we're capable of doing great harm, as the Soviets did. So Prigov did not position his work as politically oppositional, because, as he learned from the Soviet avant-garde, to fight political ideology with one's own political ideology would inevitably lead to the emergence of a new regime of domination. Instead, the idea was to help these ideological languages destroy themselves. So to give you a sense of how this conceptualist poetry worked, I want to show you a little bit of Prigov. Prigov strove to recreate the types of voices in language that embodied this ideology and take them to their logical extremes, making it hard to take them seriously. And here he was guided by a sense that it is the seriousness of these speech types which made them so dangerous. Prigov liked to say that conceptualism had to work with the ideological genres which were most widespread in the Soviet Union. In his opinion, these were appeals, proclamations, obituaries, weather forecasts, and he created his own versions of these genres. Today I'll play you some short excerpts from his obituaries, and this is from a 2001 recording of a performance he gave at Berkeley. I'll show you tiny pieces of it. There's more, and I've posted it on YouTube so you can find it there. Okay, so here's Prigov.
Центральный комитет КПСС, Верховный Совет СССр, Советское правительство с глубоким прискорбием сообщают, что 10 февраля 1837 года на 38 году жизни в результате трагической дуэли оборвалась жизнь великого русского поэта Александра Сергеевича Пушкина. Товарища Пушкина всегда отмечали принципиальность, чувство ответственности, требовательное отношение к себе и окружающим. На всех постах, куда его посылали, он проявлял беззаветную преданность порученному делу, воинскую отвагу и героизм, высокие качества патриота, гражданина и поэта. Он навсегда останется в сердцах друзей, близко знавших его, как Гуляка, Балагур, Бабник. Пушкин вечно будет жить в памяти народа, как светоча русской поэзии. Центральный комитет КПСС, Верховный Совет СССр, Советское правительство с глубоким прискорбием сообщают, что не стало графа Льва Николаевича. Всегда отвечали принципиальность, чувство ответственности, требовательное отношение к себе. На всех постах, куда его вызывали, он проявлял беззаветную преданность порученному делу, воинскому героизм, высокие качества патриота и поэта. Он навсегда останется в сердцах друзей, близко знавших его, как большой барин, увлекавшийся. Имя Толстого вечно будет жить в памяти народа, как зеркало русской революции. Центральный комитет КПСС, Верховный Совет СССр, Советское правительство с глубоким прискорбием сообщают, что 30 июня 1980 года в городе Москве на 40-м году жизни проживает Пригов.
So I skipped Lermontov and Dostoevsky, but you get the idea. As you can see, Prigov's obituaries expose the absurdities, the banal tropes, and the inhuman, mechanically reproduced qualities that made texts as simple and uncontroversial as obituaries or weather forecasts practically meaningless and unbearable to listen to. The idea was that by taking apart these speech types and exposing them for what they were, they would lose their power. But it's also important to appreciate that Prigov was not just concerned with Soviet ideology. He was convinced that any voice, any behavioral model, if given the opportunity, would assert itself with the same authoritarian domination as the Soviet regime. Thus, he produced countless hundreds, even thousands of miniature verse etudes, which captured this tendency amongst ordinary people in ordinary everyday situations, like the communal apartment. And here I'll read you a poem that is representative of this particular genre. Some people don't wash dishes, and they don't cut open chicken stomachs. And all the same, they're happy sometimes. What did they do to deserve it? But in that beautiful kingdom to come, we'll sit down at a beautiful white table, like tiny children, pure of heart, while they, their mouths wide open, will have to catch our spit out of the air. As you can see, the lyrical eye of this poem, an ordinary Soviet person, probably a dweller of the communal apartment, takes pride in doing his communal duty. But he also fantasizes about how when he's rewarded for his labor by entry to heaven, the others will be subjected to this humiliating punishment of having to catch spit in their mouths. Prigov shows us how if the average meek and oppressed Soviet individual is ever liberated from the domination of the regime, he too will quickly set about implementing his own regime of domination. During the post-Soviet years, he came to view capitalism and the free market as the strongest and most dangerous source of this same totalitarian logic. And he set about creating texts that exposed this logic, the logic of the market. Unfortunately, Prigov passed away in 2007, but before he did, he became increasingly engaged as a public intellectual and as a critic of Putin's regime. So enter our young Petersburg poets. By drawing on the experiences both of the early and late Soviet avant-gardes, the Translit artists, and Osminkin in particular, hoped to put forward a new art and a new politics that would create a more just society without the violence and totalitarian logic this entailed in and after the Russian Revolution. For these artists, the Russian protest movement that was sparked after mass fraud in the 2011 Duma elections was the opportunity they were looking for. They threw themselves and their art into the movement. The protests flourished, gaining mass resonance, and grew larger and larger until Putin's inauguration in May of 2012, when Putin responded with brutal repression. Enormous regiments of riot police beat protesters and dispersed large crowds. Many activists, a handful, maybe 10 or so, accused of inciting violence were eventually given multiple-year sentences in prison colonies, which obviously left many protesters, ordinary people, fearful that they too could be sentenced if they came out to a protest. And so the bubble of optimism for mass public activism and democratic reform burst. The Translit Circle has since continued its activism and creative activity, but the mood has really changed. In the years since, these artists have been devoting much of their energy to working through the disenchantment they've experienced since 2012, and subjecting themselves and the liberal Russian intelligentsia to a sort of self-critique. So this, I think, sets us up to look at Osminkin and his art of recent years. And so I'll show you some examples of his work. First of all, some of what Osminkin writes could be considered conventional poetry. Some is rhymed and has regular meter, which is pretty rare for contemporary poetry. And some is free verse. Most of it is side-splittingly funny, like I think his greatest influence, Prigov. He obsesses in the most painstaking details over the paradoxes and pitfalls of being a leftist poet in Putin's Russia. Compared to other contemporary leftist poets, he is distinguished by a deep sense of irony and self-critical ambivalence. And so here's an example of his poetry that I'll read for you. You know how sometimes you want to write about the working class? You go to the factory, but there's no working class there. Just some hipsters rummaging around. When suddenly someone's massive shadow flits past you, it's probably a representative of the working class, you think. And just when you're about to write, about how the working class is alive and well, the shadow steps out from behind some machinery and points its stern finger menacingly at you. Don't write about me, it says. I know your kind, you poets. You'll write all kinds of fairy tales, and then we'll spend a century cleaning up the mess. This goes on and on in this key. So in this poem, you see a typical example of Osminkin's self-irony. the young, politically engaged poet trying to develop a leftist poetics in the 21st century, wallows in nostalgia for this lost image of a strong, noble, empowered working class. He is well aware of the wealth of political theory, which says that we live in a post-industrial society and the working class is long extinct, or that class always was a fictional construct that was exploited by different social groups in their own pursuit of power. And yet he gives in to this fantasy of a broad-shouldered heroic proletarian and prepares to write, only to be told in a protracted and relatively theoretically versed monologue that the working class doesn't want poetry about itself. It knows how much trouble the intelligentsia got it into a century ago. In its free time, the working class would really prefer to go fishing, to watch soccer games, or read beautiful poems about drinking a glass of fine wine on a summer day in May, on a sunny day in May. So this is one type of Asminkin's creative output. Another is a project called Techno-Poetry. Techno-Poetry is a two-person electronic rap group made up of himself and a musician named Anton Komandirov. They produce songs which vary from catchy to deliberately annoying. They feature Komandirov's electronic beats and Asminkin's rhyming sing-song verse, shrill vocals, and a variety of lyrical persona: the intellectual, the revolutionary, the worker, the teenage girl, the xenophobic Russian patriot, and so on. So techno-poetry gives high-energy live performances. I don't really have time to show you those more than just for a second, I think, to give you an idea. This is a song called Apolitical. Okay, so that's about all we have time for. He has, like, I think, hundreds of videos on YouTube if you want to learn more. So they also publish their songs on YouTube together with videos made up of Asminkin's zany antics, dancing, face making, and of cleverly montaged clips from other YouTube videos. And I'll show you an example of this. So the song I'll show you is called "The Hipsters Are Coming," which is certainly another dose of the critical self-irony that's so important to his art. And it addresses some of the very specific aspects of the historical context I described to you, especially the disenchantment in the wake of the 2011-2012 protests. And just one more piece of context: the names he's going to mention in the first verse of this song are some of the activists who have been imprisoned after this protest. Oh, and that person right there is the other most famous leftist poet, Kirill Medvedev from Moscow, who's being arrested.
Жми на лайк за тех, кто был тебя смелей, как Филипп Костенко и Крылов Матвей. Истинно фейсбучно собрались, разошлись, воля к власти глючит, зато взор марксист. Жижик тебе в помощь, Фуко тебе в бадью. Разве может овощ огрести статью? Вынес пяток душу, тебя уже все ждут. Это же типа Viva Revolution, хипстеры идут. Хипстеры идут. Хипстеры идут. Хипстеры идут.
So the song, as you can see, parodies the technology-driven protest culture that spread throughout the world in the 2000s. As in much of Asminkin's poetry, the ironic critique is directed largely at Asminkin's own movement and his own cultural, intellectual, and political practices. It is directed at passive digital activism, reflected in his use of technological jargon, slang, and cliched protest slogans. For example, click like, the will to power is frozen, as in a computer, and it's like Viva Revolution, Viva la Revolución. So here he's taking a stab at the commodification of protest culture. Think Kendall Jenner's Pepsi commercial. But also at the excessive theoretical name dropping that is certainly a core component of his own poetry. Here we saw this in Zizek to the Rescue, Foucault and Your Badiou. So many leftist critics respond negatively to the excessive use of self-irony and self-criticism in Asminkin's poetry. Some propose that his whole aesthetic project is a disingenuous performance of conflicted self-abasing leftism. Others embrace this performance of self-contradiction, but I think do not seriously entertain the political thrust of Asminkin's work. Mark Lipovetsky, the leading specialist on Russian conceptualism, and Prigov proposes that the essence of Asminkin's creative endeavors lies in the self-ironic performance of the irresolvable contradictions between two dominant conceptions of the self. The first is the revolutionary view of the self put forward by avant-garde Soviet Marxists in the 1920s. Lipovetsky characterizes the Soviet avant-garde subjectivity as a naive modernist conception of the poetic self as whole, self-identical, and capable of transforming the world through the poetic word. The second model of selfhood is the postmodern selfhood of conceptualist poets like Prigov. This shimmering self is fragmentary, self-critical, and self-ironic, consciously avoids any narratives of positive self-identity or political change. I, however, would invite you to see this as something new and to take Asminkin's ironic exploration of these contradictions seriously, not as a futile exercise or a funny charade, but as an indispensable component of the negative work of politically engaged poetry. These contradictions are never resolved, but struggling to resolve them does give rise to movement, to transformation. And this is where Asminkin is true to the Marxist logic of the Soviet avant-garde. Many of the Marxist thinkers Asminkin engages with conceive of the self not in terms of self-assured wholeness, but rather in terms of a profound internal division, a will to action based on real suffering, an alienation upon coming to recognize yourself both as a producer of commodities and as an analogous commodity in the system of production. For Asminkin, this negativity is a necessary critical response to the uncritical enthusiasm and failures of the 2011-2012 protests. From the postmodern perspective of Lipovetsky, there can be no reconciliation between these two conceptions of self. I propose that Asminkin performs the contradictions between the revolutionary and postmodern selves not merely as a self-ironic spectacle, but with the sincere intention of using the experience of Prigov and the conceptualists to develop new artistic and political strategies that will be effective both in the struggle for social justice and in neutralizing the latent totalitarianism of the avant-garde ethic. So in closing, I'll say that Asminkin urges his readers to unite as a poetariat, a group defined not by its loss of ownership of the means of production, but by a sort of existential loss, the loss of a coherent sense of self, the basic ability to constitute truth, and a basic platform for political engagement. What is unique about Asminkin is his renewed sense that the fragmented modern individual can and must continue to act, albeit respecting the complexity that was identified by earlier poets like Prigov. For Asminkin, Prigov was the prototype of this new poetarian person. This ethical ideal suggests that if we work to preserve a conscious ethical relation to language and the way we use it, then we can come to recognize in the shimmering non-identity of the modern individual an incredible potential for growth. And as we confront the perils of a world in which establishing truth is not as easy as it once seemed, I think this can be a very, very valuable lesson that we can learn from a poet and from a generation that's, I think, confronted it earlier in sort of late Putinism and the sort of ideological shimmering that comes with it. Anyway, thanks a lot. I hope you enjoyed.
Get ready for some romance. Here is Professor Tumarkin.
I'm really glad to see so many of you. This event is normally packed tonight. It's really packed. Alex, there's a seat right there for you, next to Jason and between Jason and Alla. Please have a seat. Thank you. This is a very dramatic period in our country's history, in the world's history. The reason that I show the poster from last year's event, Russian-U.S. relations, what next? How many of you in the audience came to this event last fall? Right. It was great. In fact, for the first time in my decades at Wellesley, I thought it was so good that I invited the same speakers back. This is Angela Stent, who directs the Georgetown Center for Russian Studies and Eurasian Studies at Georgetown. She was also National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia. And Lilia Shevtsova, who actually is from the Academy of Sciences in Moscow. This year is the Catherine Wasserman Davis Senior Scholar at the Harvard University Davis Center. So they're going to give another presentation, Russian-U.S. relations, what next, on October 4th in this room. That was before the election, and they talked about what if Hillary gets elected, which was likely, and what if Donald Trump gets elected, which was not likely. So I hope that you'll all want to come to that. So here we have Russia Now tonight. All I did was send to my genius poster maker this wonderful image of Vladimir Putin. It's a photograph that was taken on August 3rd, 2017, when he was on a fishing trip in Tuva, which is in southern Siberia. I sent it to Masha Lipman, who's actually a very interesting and exciting scholar who's going to speak here in the spring. She's from Moscow. And I asked her what she thought. She said two things. First of all, in Russia, this could never appear because it is light blue. And the word goluboy, light blue, in Russian means gay. So Putin would never be able to be associated with anything that's in light blue. The other thing she actually noted was that it says on his torso that Putin's torso is free and open to the public, which she thought was really just right. Of course, the image actually was this one of Putin on the fishing trip, wearing not a whole lot on top except his cross. He was wearing that same cross, by the way, when George W. Bush met him and looked into his soul, looked into his eyes and said he could see his soul, and then said that Putin was a man he thought he could trust. Remember that? George took a long time for W to live that one down. And he had been wearing, Putin had been wearing his crucifix. I had also sent to the poster person this much more phallic image of Putin and a pike. So the story was that Vladimir Putin, for his vacation, went to Siberia fishing for pike. And it actually, he spent 2 hours chasing this pike. Which led to a lot of humorous things, like how many, what does he get paid for an hour? He's spending 2 hours chasing a pike. It took him this long. He got the pike, and he wore this silly snorkely thing and wetsuit and so on, but he was very excited. So the question is, why do we see this image of Putin, and why did I put it on the poster? So I'd like to start off by talking about Vladimir Putin's symbolic politics and the Kremlin's symbolic politics. Even though I have to say that I have long believed that the United States focuses much too much on who is the individual leader in the Kremlin. Who is the individual leader in the Kremlin? There was much too much of that. President Reagan getting along with Mikhail Gorbachev, Bill Clinton relating to Boris Yeltsin man to man and giving the two men who like to drink, giving each other bear hugs, then George Bush and Putin. Putin and Obama clearly disliked each other. Obama said that Putin looked at like a bored school boy. When he saw him, and Putin tried not as hard as he should have to hide his own personal racism. George McCain said terrible things about Putin, a former KGB agent who has plunged his country into tyranny and so on. I believe it does not serve our interests, nor is it proper to personalize the U.S.-Russian relationship this way. Ronald Reagan was decidedly an anti-communist. And of course, he branded the Soviet Union as the focus of evil in the modern world. but he never said anything personal against any individual Soviet leader. And anyway, is it so helpful? Is trying to figure out one man really the best way to understand Russian politics and construct a policy that serves our national interest? A great deal of power is concentrated in the Kremlin with a very weak legislature in this illiberal democracy. But Putin does not rule as an absolute monarch. Somehow you think, you read in the West as though Putin is in charge of everything. And every policy, every event, he has ordered it. I just told my students in my Soviet course that the only leader I can think of who probably was involved in every important political major event that happened in his country was Frederick the Great of Prussia in the 18th century. But that was a small, homogeneous country, and the guy was a genius, which Putin is not. So it's much more important to understand that the Kremlin, and I think Professor Logvinenko is going to talk about this, is a very complex conglomeration of institutions. It's not one institution. It contains many ecosystems, a presidential administration, an institution within the Kremlin that shapes its ideology, particularly through the controlled media, producing a kind of presidential product and using marketing technologies to sell patriotic ideology with a kind of nationalistic Russian brand. The Kremlin has a military and industrial complex. It's another ecosystem with its own structure, institution, and funds. There's a white or ultranationalist ecosystem in the Kremlin funded by the military industrial complex, but with a much further reach that's very tied into the Russian Orthodox Church. So it's much more complex, and we would be wise to learn about and have relationships with many people in Russia and not mostly think about how Trump and Putin might get along as individuals. President Trump said that Putin praised him, that Putin called him brilliant. I don't know if you ever heard that. President Putin did not call him brilliant. He called him yarky. Yarky means a bright, like a Crayola crayon is bright. He never came out with, my favorite comment, not the brightest crayon in the box, right? He didn't say that, but bright, colorful, flamboyant. I saw it. He said, "Что, он не яркий? Яркий, he's flamboyant." That's not bright. That's not brilliant. That was the only so-called praise. But I do now want to focus on Putin's self-presentation because it's a very important moment. On March 18th, 2018, which will happen to be the 4th anniversary of the Russian annexation, of the referendum and the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, Russia will have its presidential election in which Vladimir Putin will be running for re-election for his 4th term. If he wins and serves out that term until 2024, because it's a 6-year term, he will have basically been the leader of Russia, assuming that he was the leader of Russia during the Medvedev presidency when Putin was prime minister, for 24 years, which is exactly the same number of years that Stalin was in power, from 1929 to 1953. So this fishing trip suddenly came up. And the Kremlin, it wasn't sort of paparazzi, it was the Kremlin that posted these photographs of Putin looking pretty good at 64. So this is what's coming up. On October 7th of this year, Vladimir Putin is going to turn 65. In Russia, that's old. The life expectancy in Russia is actually higher than it's ever been before at something like 71.9 years. But the life expectancy for men, which is still higher than it's ever been before, is 66.5 years, which is a lot better than it was in the early 1990s when it was for men down below 60. It was 59 some years for men. So a 65-year-old man in Russia is considered old. And what is Vladimir Putin going to do about that? Well, he's going to take his clothes off and go fishing for pike. And so this was clearly some kind of campaign. Now, this is the iconic Putin on the horse. And so when the fishing trip photos came out, particularly the Western press said, "Oh, yeah, this is Putin. We remember he was he was topless on the horse." As a matter of fact, a Russian friend, when I first learned about the fishing trip, she sent a link with the photos, and she wrote, "Opat's topless, topless again." Putin's topless again. The important thing is, again, this has not been his consistent image in the past few years, although the Western press thinks that that's all he's been doing is, sort of riding bareback on horses. Now, there have been many issues, many images of various sorts. Now, of course, there were a lot of, sort of send-ups of what it might have looked like. So we had various views, but basically, the image was of Putin, who had all of these various views. So Igor, if you could help me show, I want to show this little image. I don't know if there are any students here who were in my Putin seminar last semester, but I hope there are students here who are first years who will take my Putin seminar coming up this semester. In any event, at that time, every once in a while, I showed them a different scene from this Putin calendar. It's usually on my bulletin board on my kitchen at home, but here it is. So let's take a look. We can make the volume up.
Here it is, the Putin 2017 calendar. 12 months, 12 portraits of the president. Putin with a candle, Putin with a child, Putin by himself, with war veterans, and so on and so on. 365 days of Vladimir Putin. This is August. Putin with a combine harvester.
Look at the way he's dressed, just right for the camera.
Putin with a delta plane and a crane. Moving on to October, Putin with a horse. Putin dressed as a fighter pilot who says that the aim is to create the kind of army which will guarantee Russia's sovereignty, the respect of her partners, and a stable peace. This is December, and finally, the calendar looks ahead to 2018 with this portrait and these words of the president. Vladimir Putin says, "Russia is a peace-loving and a self-sufficient country. We don't need other people's territories," he says. "We don't need other people's natural resources. But if we are threatened, we are prepared to use weapons to guarantee our security." Happy New Year.
Okay, thank you. So that's a different one. Okay, so we have this fishing trip. Actually, it kind of went viral, and these images were everywhere, and it was very important to Russians how they were being viewed abroad. There was an article with the title photo of Putin that we have in our poster saying, "Putin's torso is driving Americans crazy." They're all so excited about it. And then you also had another issue in which you had the Russian press making a very big deal about how the Western media positively assessed Putin's physique. An article in Rio Novosti said that Gazeta Time, meaning Time magazine, published this collection of photographs and called Putin a sportsman who loves adventure. Actually, here's what Time really wrote. "The images are the latest in a series that seek to portray Russia's leader as an adventurous and rugged outdoorsman and athlete." That's very different. So you have all of these different images of Putin as a macho leader and so on. However, there are some changes, and as I actually there should be one. Whoops. So there's no. I had a photograph of Putin with children. In any event, this is a kind of a revived macho image as the election is coming up. But there's clearly been an effort to show Putin as kind of Grandpa Putin. he's got to appeal to the younger generation. In March of 2017, there were anti-corruption riots or protests in Moscow. There were others even in St. Petersburg, and many of the people were your age. I'm not looking at the gray-haired folks here. The age of students, student-age people, people in the young 20s who are disillusioned. There's been so much coming out about the corruption in the Kremlin, about Putin's corruption, particularly Medvedev, the prime minister. And so how are you going to appeal to those young people and even younger? And so there's been a new effort. There was a call-in show in which Putin was then surrounded with children. He also, for the first time, there was these Oliver Stone videos that were interviewed videos that were made in June. And for the first time, Putin revealed that he's a grandfather. He's been very, very private about his family life. Well, not always. Actually, he and his wife announced their divorce. I remember I was in Petersburg at the time, and so was Putin. So Putin and his wife, in the intermission during the performance of Esmeralda, somehow, at the Mariinsky Theater, announced that they were going to get divorced. So that was very public. But he's been very private about his children, his two daughters. Nobody knows where they live. Nobody knows what they do. It's Katya and Masha, I think. But now he suddenly revealed that he's got two grandsons. One of them's even going to nursery school already. The other one was just born, and then there was big applause. He also went to a special camp. It was a huge program for intellectually gifted children, and spent hours with these children, being photographed and trying to show that he's kind of a very sort of avuncular, grandparental kind of figure. So Diedushka is the Russian word for grandfather. You had Diedushka Lenin, even though Lenin died at the age of 53 and hated children anyway. Grandchildren, but he was viewed as portrayed as being with children. And Stalin was portrayed, sort of as helping out children. So that's the new image of Putin, and that's something to watch. I think there's going to have to be more of it because he's turning 65, and this business of, so he's got a great physique, and everybody was talking about, yes, Botox this, and plastic surgery. So that's one aspect to look at. Another aspect of symbolic politics that I wanted to just talk about very briefly has to do with monuments. Very interesting. Russians responded in a viral and virulent way to the removal of Confederate monuments in the United States. It was all over the internet. It was all over Russian sites. Overwhelmingly, people were appalled at the notion of taking down monuments. They said that that's what the Bolsheviks did. The Bolsheviks took down monuments. Now, it's true that actually the Bolsheviks were pretty careful. They took down some monuments. They didn't destroy too many of them. Because they understood the artistic value of, there were monuments of statues of Nicholas II, Alexander III, they kept all those. They did take down a lot of hammer and sickle emblems, and it's true they destroyed it in a large number of churches. The really biggest removal of monuments in the Soviet Union was the massive de-Stalinization under Nikita Khrushchev between 1956 and 1962 particularly, where you really had all the Stalin monuments taken away. But the Russian take was that this should not be happening. In particularly they were very sensitive because in Ukraine and in Poland, well particularly Ukraine is sensitive because of the anti-Russian regime that came in 2014, a movement called Leninapad, which is the falling of Lenin. There had been declared that all of the Lenin statues, the communist era statues, should go. Russians were very upset about this. And in fact, on August 17th, 2017, the very same day that President Putin bemoaned the loss of these beautiful monuments to the Confederacy that he was so upset about, the director of the Historical Memory Institute in Ukraine announced that Ukraine is officially Lenin-free, that all 1,320 Lenin monuments are gone. And so Russians were very sensitive, and they also pointed out that you should make a difference between the monuments to generals and to Jefferson Davis and those monuments that are in cemeteries that were being removed of ordinary soldiers. But one of the things that's very striking is that while in America monuments are coming down, in Russia monuments are going up. There's been a flurry, really a crowd of new monuments that have been put up in Russia. And interestingly enough, the Kremlin is fine with it. They're not happy about it. There are a number of monuments to Stalin in various places, and the Kremlin is not a supporter of a return of the cult of Stalin by any means. But they know that there are people to whom this is important, and they put up with it. There was a statue of Saint Vladimir that was put up right outside the Kremlin wall. Saint Vladimir, as those students who took my medieval Russia course will remember, was the Russian prince in Kiev who actually baptized Russia. He was in the Byzantine Empire, as luck would have it, in Crimea, where he was baptized and then came back, and in 1988 brought Christianity to Russia. And there has been, for 150 years, a fantastic statue. What?
1988.
Sorry, 1998? What?
1988?
988, sorry, 988. 988. 988, the millennium was celebrated in 1988. There's a marvelous statue of Saint Vladimir, but it's in Kiev, which was fine until a while ago, but Kiev is the capital of an enemy country, Ukraine, so Russia had to get its own. People started joking that Vladimir Putin had to have another Vladimir next to him. So this huge cross-bearing statue was put up. Also, Russia inaugurated in the fall its first statue of Ivan the Terrible as a monarch who should be respected. This was very controversial. Nobody really liked very much about it. This is another image that I'm going to get to in a minute. And then all kinds of monuments. There's one that I find kind of troubling, but my Russian friends say, oh, don't worry about it. There's going to be opened next month in Moscow a monument to Kalashnikov. Kalashnikov designed the AK-47 rifle, which is responsible for the deaths probably of millions of people, particularly in Africa. It's the most widely sold weapon in the world. It was, of course, designed in 1947, and there's going to be this ridiculous statue of him holding his Kalashnikov rifle right in the center of Moscow, against the background of half a globe because of the global reach of the weapon. And then on top of it, St. George slaying the dragon. It's interesting that what you have here is what makes the monument issue so different in Russia than in the United States is the perennial dominance of the state over the people. So in Russia, there's an imposed political consensus. It's true that over 80% of the people approve of Putin. He's got this fantastic approval, and he wants to rule out any act that might stir undesired political sentiments, like tearing down Lenin or removing his corpse from the mausoleum, which is a very, very active debate going on right now. People are saying it's the 100th anniversary of the revolution. Why is Lenin still lying there in the mausoleum? But effectively, the idea here is that it's okay to have any kind of symbols you want as long as you actually stay loyal to the Kremlin. So it's a pretty smart approach. I think it's a mix of brutal militarism and religion that you see in some of these monuments, like Ivan the Terrible with his cross and so on. And then the last thing I want to talk about, just very briefly, about the symbolic politics is the centennial of the Russian Revolution. Yes, we're going to have a lecture here, I hope in this room, on October 25th, which is the date of the Russian Revolution, October 25th, by Bill Rosenberg. It's called Reds. What the Bolsheviks seized when they seized power. But in Russia, it's a very, very troubling history. What are you going to If the Kremlin could make the anniversary go away, it could. For Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, 1917 was a nightmare. It's the worst thing you can imagine. It was a popular revolt from below that overthrew a legitimate ruler, Nicholas II. The revolution destroyed a great empire, the Russian Empire. It caused Russia to be defeated in World War I. It allowed the creation of what Donald Trump would call a failed state, the Soviet Union, that itself imploded in 1991. Putin especially blames Lenin personally. And so many people are blaming Lenin for everything, including the fall of the ruble. And so all kinds of images are coming out. First of all, people are saying there should be a new movie about Lenin starring Leonardo DiCaprio because he looks so much like the young Vladimir Ulyanov, which I think he sort of does, you know. He does. And then here is a typical cartoon of Putin with his judo outfit saying, you know, with toppling Lenin and saying, you'll answer for this. Here's another one that came out, a meme that came out, and Lenin is saying, you know, we should impose sanctions on Russia. And Obama, wearing Stalin's uniform, is saying, okay. So there's Obama. This is my favorite, actually. Lenin is a rubber ducky. So there are many irreverent views of Lenin. We're going to see how it plays out, this anniversary of the Russian Revolution, and how it's remembered. But it's a very troubling subject for the Kremlin. And what I'm looking at, and I look forward to researching it, is what, if anything, is going to be commemorated on December 20th, when we have the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the Cheka, the first secret police. And so that should be a grim and grisly subject appropriate to Russian area studies. Thank you very much. I look forward to
Thank you, Professor Tumarkin. I see some students are shuffling off to their dorms to engage in homework. So,
they didn't like the ducky.
These are very fraught days, as we can see. Our last speaker today is going to be Professor Logvinenko from the Political Science. The floor is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming tonight, and I'll promise to be fairly speedy so we can get to your questions. I have a kind of a potpourri of topics that I'm going to touch upon. Maybe I'll be quick, and we can then bring them up in the Q&A if they're of interest to you. So I'm going to briefly touch on three topics. They're much more kind of contemporary and kind of immediate issues in Russian politics. And economics. So I'm going to talk about the state of the Russian economy right now and going into the presidential elections, which is very important. I'm going to briefly touch on an aspect of the Trump-Russia controversy, leaving much of it for this upcoming panel that we have on the Russia-U.S. relationship that's coming up in October, right? And then I'm going to talk about an aspect of Russia's place in the global economy today that I find that's often overlooked, but I find my own research to be an incredibly important part of understanding of Russian politics today. So, okay. So I went back to my slides from a year ago. You know, we do this panel every year, and this was kind of a projection of Russian economy, Russian economic growth. This was in 2016. Things were looking pretty dire. Russia entered a relatively prolonged recession, multiple quarters of negative economic growth. Looking at it today, we're seeing kind of an upsurge. So Russia is coming out of a recession. There's positive economic growth being recorded. Things are kind of looking up in the very immediate sense. In fact, Russia was the best performing stock market in the world in 2016. That's not to say much. It was probably the worst performing stock market before that. But actually, the Russian stock market has been the best performing in the world in 1996, 1997, 1999, 2001, 2010, maybe even. So if you're into volatility, Russian stock market is where you want to be. The inflation rate, this is kind of politically very important. Russia, in the post-Soviet period, Russia historically has had very high rates of inflation. Lots of instability, people kind of not really trusting banks, not really trusting to have their savings last to tomorrow. Russia just recorded its lowest inflation rate in the post-Soviet period. So this kind of impression of stability. So this was just in August of this year. Russia's foreign exchange reserves, after going down precipitously after the financial crisis and after the sanctions were imposed in 2013, are ticking up, which means that Russia is in better position today to withstand an external financial crisis, for example, which is very important because Russia has a free-floating currency, so it's actually relatively defenseless against perturbations in the global financial system. So just in the last year or so, we see the Russian government building up reserves. So that's just to say, in the medium term, Russia is in better position to be more stable. The unemployment rate, now the figures here is the y-axis isn't marked, but so the top is about 9%, the bottom is about 5%. So the unemployment rate in Russia is a multi-year low. So if you're looking for a job, it's a good time. It's a good time to be in Russia. And the International Monetary Fund projects, not spectacular rates of growth. Russia has a kind of problem with demography, all kinds of economic troubles, low prices of oil and the like. But overall, we're kind of projecting positive rates of growth on the order of, maybe 1.5% to 2%. Actually, Russian economy has been exceeding those projections this year, so perhaps it will do better. And another thing that was worthwhile mentioning is that Russia, of course, is very much an oil-dependent economy, but Russia is very much unlike other oil-dependent economies in the sense it has the largest, among the kind of oil-dependent rentier states, Russia has the largest manufacturing sector. It has one of the largest service economies, in kind of a high standards of education, lots of kind of scientific activity, lots of women in labor force, actually, and significant research base. So all of those sectors that get pushed out in times of when oil prices are high are actually comparatively doing very well when oil prices are low. But there's continued unresolved issues in Russian political economy. First and foremost is the issue of property rights enforcement, licensing and regulation continue to be kind of onerous government restrictions, potential for government expropriation and the like. Russia has had a hard time going back to the early 1990s attracting long-term foreign investment. There's the infrastructure is in kind of a poor state. There's been this recent trend of regionalization is Russia is integrating its economy with its immediate neighbors, its former Soviet republics, but its integration into the trade integration into the global economy is slowing down. So they're erecting these barriers around the Eurasian Union. So there's lots of trade within Russia, which has some interesting kind of strange byproducts like there's now recently has been in the news. There's a problem with the dumping of sugar by Belarus and Kazakhstan in Russia, which is kind of a parochial political issue. But generally speaking, Russia is more integrated into its immediate neighborhood and less trade integrated into the global economy than it was before. There's generally lack of innovation, and overall levels of immigration and brain drain have been up since 2011 or so, and massive wealth inequality. So Russia is actually, wealth controlled by the top 10% here. Russia is ahead of the pack of, Turkey, Indonesia, Philippines, even the United States, Egypt, Brazil. Russia is a very unequal society and continues to be so. So the bottom line here is, problems that have been kind of festering since the transition from communism continue to be problems, sort of institutional problems. But in the short term, the Russian economy is actually doing better. And so that's sort of relevant for thinking about the type of, policy flexibility that, say, the government has in the coming years and in the upcoming elections as well. This is the graph that I really like to show that to everybody who is willing to listen. So, just a few years ago, some researchers were able to reconstruct the long-term time series of Russian economic growth, and it's adjusted for, I think, 1913 as 100, and so this is going back to 1885. And there's two major recessions in the kind of 100 and, let's say, 30-year history of Russia. And those two major recessions, the first among them is World War I and the Civil War. So it was the largest decline in the standard of living. World War II, for that matter, was a tremendous trial for the country, but actually, economically speaking, it wasn't as big of a disaster as the economic recession that the country experienced in the 1990s. So, which it's very recent in the memory of many Russians, and so basically, so long as a political leadership can deliver economic growth that doesn't take them back to the 1990s, they're likely to be grateful and they're likely to support that regime. So, just so you understand the level of economic kind of disturbance that the transition from the Soviet Union to whatever semi-free markets that we have now has produced in Russian society. Just to briefly touch on the state of the Russian-U.S. relationship. So every year, you talk about the state of in the last few years anyway, we're kind of hitting a new nadir in the Russo-American relationship. It's the case today as well. So in 2015, this picture kind of represented, the state of the Russian-American relationship. And when Trump was elected, lots of Russians sort of thought, like, we're onto this phase, right? There's plenty of naked Putin here before, but in fact, the more of a tenor of the Russian-American relationship has been that even though there were these perhaps unwarranted expectations on the part of some members of the Trump team, there were apparently some rather unwarranted expectations among many in the Russian government. We're kind of back to the rather unpleasant state of Russian-American relationship, and so I'm not gonna get through the. I'm gonna skip over the Trump-Russia business so much, and we can talk about it more. But just assuming, let's say, that Russians try to cultivate a close relationship to the Trump people, Trump as candidate, Trump as president, and that Trump had continued to have some sympathy for the Russian leadership. That relationship, if in fact it was being cultivated and it existed in reality, has actually in many ways didn't work out, and as a matter of fact it backfired. So a few things I can mention here. So given the revelations and ongoing investigation, these continuing scandals and the like, there's absolutely no chance that Trump can lift the sanctions. As a matter of fact, Congress just passed overwhelmingly a new series of sanctions on Russia. So if the Russians were looking to remove the sanctions, which they were, that effort backfired. Just the other day, BuzzFeed reported the secret memorandum that the Russian government had proposed to normalize relationships with the United States. I sort of go back and forth. That you read in the American press like this idea that Russian leadership is kind of clueless about the way the American democracy works. So they sort of believe, well, Trump was elected, so he's sort of this dictator, so he can do whatever he likes. And I just can't imagine that there's really that kind of dim of a view of but apparently these really recent revelations kind of confirm it. So apparently there was this conversation about full normalization of the relationship in March. And Angela Stent, who'll be here in a few weeks, was quoted in this article. She says, it just ignores everything that caused the relationship to deteriorate and pretends that the election interference in the U.S. and the Ukraine crisis just never happened, right? So another quote from a kind of a DC Russia expert, Stephen Pfeiffer, Putin doesn't seem to understand that Trump powers are not the same as his. The checks and balances, the special prosecutor, the congressional investigations have tied Trump hands in ways that didn't occur to Putin. I just have a hard, I don't know, I just have a hard time believing that the Russian kind of side has that big of a misunderstanding of American politics, but everything seems to confirm it. So, and then Trump bungling of both the domestic and foreign policy gave a huge boost to the pro-EU forces in recent elections in Europe. And that part of the equation is far more important for Russia than anything that's happening in the U.S. So in the Netherlands, in France, in Austria, and even in upcoming elections in Germany, it's likely that these kind of interferences have led to a more united Europe. And EU, in fact, just renewed the sanctions recently for another 6 months. And there's a kind of an interesting implication for Russian domestic politics in the sense that Trump's successful election is sort of a liability, kind of rhetorically, for Putin domestically. Putin's re-election in 2018 isn't really in doubt, but what's at stake here is the sort of strength of the support, levels of turnout. And so Putin can no longer, as efficiently or as provocatively use the American boogie man or boogie woman, if it was Hillary Clinton, during the elections. There was this joke going around in Moscow in May when the United States withdrew from the Paris Accords, and there was snow in Moscow in May, and they said, well, Americans withdraw from Paris Accords and it snows in Moscow. The connections that Americans are to blame. And it's true that it's like a rhetorically very useful thing to the regime. But it's sort of harder to run against the American deep state than against a personality like Hillary Clinton. This picture, those of you who know Russian history, I'm sure Professor Tumarkin had some difficulties with this cover, as did I. Of course, the St. Basil's Cathedral doesn't actually represent the center of Russian power, and there's a little bit of a tinge of this in this type of discussion of Russia in modern American politics. But nevertheless, I want to touch on the last kind of subject and sort of interesting twist on thinking about Russian politics today. So this Russia as a globalized kleptocracy, and some of the reasons why Russian leadership today is so animated about the sanctions regime. So those of you who've maybe followed Russian politics have heard that in these secret conversations with various members of the Trump team, they brought up this issue of the adoption question, which of course is the code word for sanctions. And although Russia has withstood the sanction regime, it sort of makes it very difficult to continue business as usual. And the business as usual in Russia has been to acquire control of lucrative assets within Russia and then offer them up in global equities markets and to make a buck. That has been the kind of modus operandi in Russia. So when we think of Russia today, or when Americans think of Russia, they sort of imagine these kind of North Korea-esque images of military walking through the Red Square. But if you kind of take a little bit slightly different angle from a different side of the Kremlin, you'll see this. You'll see Moscow City, kind of the downtown, kind of modern skyscraper kind of neighborhood in Russia emerging. And so Russia today is in many ways a rather a different country. So I want to just briefly, in about a few minutes here, tell you a story of a Russian oligarch who's kind of got in the crosshairs of the Kremlin and what happened to him. And I think his story illustrates very well the kind of internal political struggles among the Russian elites. This is a graph. So the red line here represents levels of financial openness. That is how accessible Russia to foreign investors since, let's say, the 1990s. So during the Yeltsin, during the early transition period, there's still lots of restrictions, and it was sort of midway open. Under Putin, the Russian economy has become incredibly open. So there's no restrictions on movement of capital. There's no restrictions on investing in the Russian stocks. The Russians have fewer restrictions of taking money out of the country. So there's this kind of general decontrol of capital. Meanwhile, the blue line here represents the general levels of political openness. And so as the country became more and more authoritarian, as it became more and more financially open, is this kind of combination of autocracy and open and free markets in Russia. And so this is Vladimir Putin meeting with this fellow named Yevtushenkov, who was the head of the Systema conglomerate up until recently. So I just want to read you something that I wrote recently on the subject. So Yevtushenkov. So before Yevtushenkov lost his multi-billion-dollar fortune and spent 3 months under house arrest, he was warned. He was having a conversation with a fellow oligarch who was himself in exile in London, and he told him, "You must, плюнь на это все. You must spit on all this. Stay in London. You have enough money here. You won't starve. You're not poor. Then I don't know. Maybe you'll go back. You'll go to court. But if you go back there, I think you'll have problems." So this was Sergei Pugachev, who was another Russian exile, who was formerly known as Kremlin's banker, who was hiding out in London in 2014. And so this very fact that Yevtushenko found himself in Kremlin's crosshairs was a huge surprise to many in the business elite. He was known to keep a safe distance from politics, only getting involved when absolutely necessary. Yevtushenko was fond of saying that in order to be a successful businessman in Russia, one's participation in politics had to be carefully calibrated. When I came upon this quote, I just kind of jumped up in the air. He had such a keen understanding of Russian politics, this fellow. He said, if your political influence is smaller than your business, it will be taken away from you. If your political influence is bigger than your business, then you are a politician. And so he said, for over 20 years, Yevtushenko had successfully fine-tuned his political influence to match the size of his growing business ambitions. He began his rise as the head of the Moscow Committee on Science and Technology under the tutelage of a powerful Moscow mayor, Yuri Lushkov. And for almost 20 years, Lushkov presided over a city that accounted for something like 80% of the Russian financial resources. And so being close to Lushkov was a very lucrative position. After Vladimir Putin ascended to presidency in 2000, which made the affiliation with Lushkov, who had his own presidential ambitions, so it made those affiliations into a liability. Yevtushenko was happy to part ways with his longtime protector, and he'd advice that Putin gave all other oligarchs: stay out of politics entirely. In fact, he told the Financial Times at that time, he said, Lushkov and I started to think in different ways and have different outlooks on life all of a sudden in 2004. And so Yevtushenko never really wanted to be a politician anyway, and it wasn't like he had no influence. Much like all other oligarchs in Russia at that time, they could just phone up Putin. Putin would normally answer the phone. So because of the weakness of the rule of law institutions and the original sin of privatization in the 1990s, people like Yevtushenko could never really be fully secure in ownership of their assets. Being among the most pragmatic members of the Russian business elite, he took every conceivable step to safeguard his empire from the competitors and the reach of the state. So he arranged for Systema to be controlled through a Luxembourg holding company, so through an offshore subsidiary. Because minority shareholder rights were weakly enforced in Russia, buying a small number of shares in a number of different companies was not a wise wealth management strategy. So nothing short of a majority stake in the company could guarantee control over the management and the cash flows of the company. So once in control, Yevtushenko sold minority stakes to foreign investors in order to obtain new streams of income, raise investment capital, and increase the valuation of Systema, his holding company, and most importantly, to provide a measure of additional security against the potential expropriation of the state. This is the strategy that was taken by every Russian oligarch going back to the 1990s. So after Systema consolidated its ownership of Russia's largest mobile operator, MTS, in 1995, he oversaw its listing on the New York Stock Exchange, where 49% of the company is still in free float. In 2005, Systema itself, nominating Morgan Stanley among other investment banks, oversaw its own initial public offering on the London Stock Exchange, where it successfully raised $1.3 billion. By 2012, 40% of Systema was in free float in both Russia and the UK, and Yevtushenko retained remaining control of the company. And so the Financial Times, when covering the listing of Systema on the London Stock Exchange, said, this gave the additional political protection to the company at the time of the growing concern of the rising role of the Kremlin. And Kremlin's involvement in big business became kind of a fact of life in Russia when Putin came to power. Andrew Barnes, political scientist who covered this issue for a long time, he kind of made this distinction. With Putin in power, the state stopped being merely a corruptible facilitator of exchange to becoming a primary competitor for assets. So in 2003, we had the arrest of Russia's wealthiest politician, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who went on along with his partner to spend 10 years in a Siberian prison. His company, UKOS, wound up being under the auspices of Rosneft, which itself undergone an IPO in London and raised about $10 billion a year later. In fact, hiring the same investment bankers that Systema did just a year earlier. And so it was this Khodorkovsky affair that was on everybody's mind when it became known that that Rosneft was going after Yevtushenko in 2013. And so, in the course of several, politically motivated trials, Yevtushenko spent 3 months in prison after coming back from that conversation in London. His company was essentially taken away from him. He decided not to fight against the Russian state, and the shares worth some $4 billion in an oil company that he owned called Bashneft were transferred to the state, which later sold it off to Rosneft, another state-owned company. And so, subsequently, Rosneft, which is now the largest oil company in the world, which is being managed by Putin's friend Igor Sechin, completed the largest takeover in Russian history in 2013, buying Tenka BP venture for $55 billion. It then sold 20% of the company to British Petroleum. And in 2015, it finally settled a long-standing lawsuit against the UKOS shareholders for about $4 billion. And just recently, in 2016, another 20% of the company was sold to another offshore kind of unknown entity involving an Italian bank, a Swiss oil trading firm, the government of Qatar, a firm registered in the Cayman Islands, a Singapore investment outfit, a London law firm, and the Russian state-owned investment bank of VTB. And so the second largest shareholder of Rosneft BP wasn't even notified of the sale. And so I just want to bring your attention to the fact that this kind of dealing in the Russian economy isn't anything new. Property rights aren't really protected. There are really no independent courts. Whatever the main guy in the Kremlin says goes. But I think there's very little attention being paid to the extent to which Western financial institutions and Western financial intermediaries kind of serve their role in kind of bringing these contested properties, contested assets into the pool of global capital. So I had a research project this summer. I had a research assistant. I said, Google the top 15 largest American banks and just put the name of the bank in Google and just said, Bank of America money laundering, HSBC money laundering, Citibank money laundering, and every one of those has been involved in some kind of major money laundering operation. So HSBC was caught laundering $7 billion of Mexican cartel money in 2012. New York Stock Exchange allowed dozens of phantom Chinese companies to be listed in 2010, costing investors some $34 billion between 2007 and 2011. London Stock Exchange just recently lowered its standards of corporate governance to get the Saudi Arabian oil company Aramco to list there. Deutsche Bank was fined $630 million for laundering $10 billion out of Russia. It was also discovered that Deutsche Bank served as a personal bank of the dictatorship of Turkmenistan. These kind of infractions going back to the Bank of New York, where this fellow, the 8th businessman that was in that meeting with Donald Jr., Irakli Kavaladze, he was involved in laundering of some $1.4 billion through the Bank of New York. And firms like Goldman Sachs, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, UBS, Credit Suisse, Citibank, JP Morgan, Societe Generale, all of these firms, despite the sanctions, continue to facilitate the exit of Russian money and money out of other kind of unwieldy jurisdictions into the global financial markets. And so long as that's the case, and so long as it's profitable for them to just simply pay the fines and continue operating as usual, we'll have folks like these essentially sleeping well at night. So that's all for my presentation, and we're looking forward to your questions. Thanks. All right.
Thank you, Professor Logvinenko, and please join me in a general applause for all of the speakers. And now, once our panelists are sitting at the panel, we can begin the question and answer session. So, questions for any of the speakers? We can begin now.
Hi. I might have missed this because I came in about 10 minutes late, I think. But did you talk about the influence that Navalny has had on, like, the current political climate and, like, on the youth? Like, you mentioned the protests in the spring and over the summer. Like, I think his like YouTube videos have been hugely influential among youth. So, did you touch on that? I don't know. Okay.
I actually have a slide here. Thinking we might get to it. So this is what we know about the median Russian voter. Okay, it's a she. There's more women in Russia. So anti-immigration. They're anti-immigration. They're socialist. They're pro-state intervention. They're pro-state dependency. So they want more state in their lives. They're anti-regime change. They're generally pro-elections, and they're really concerned about issues like healthcare, I meant to say policing, and education. And so Navalny only hits about half of those. Okay, so he is very much anti-immigration. I mean, by American standard, he would be considered to be just an outright racist. He's not crazy about state intervention. He's not crazy about state dependency. He's sort of pro-regime change. He likes elections. And he talks about corruption. And he appeals to a very narrow group of urbanites who have cars, apartments, who pay taxes. And so his influence, in my opinion, is very much limited to that group of people. Now, we just had elections, the city council elections in Moscow, where the opposition did really, really well. In fact, the district in which Putin is registered to vote just had, I think, 11 out of the 12 council people being from the opposition. So there's no doubt that urban areas can continue to kind of represent the base of support for Navalny and people like him. But generally speaking, in Russia as a whole, this is something that Mikhail Khodorkovsky, when he was in prison, he wrote these several essays called Left Turn 1, Left Turn 2, and he essentially talked about the idea that in order to be successful in Russian politics and in a democratic, openly contested election, you have to be, essentially socialist. You have to be pro-state intervention. You want more kind of greater intervention by the state, more redistribution, kind of more, generally speaking, what we would consider to sort of. So Bernie Sanders would probably do really well in Russia, but Navalny is more of like more of like a Hillary Clinton, more like a racist Hillary Clinton, I guess.
Gun nut into the picture too.
What's that?
Gun nut. Too.
And a gun nut, yes. So yeah.
He views personal weapons as a solution to immigration.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, yeah.
Other questions?
Hi, I have another question for Professor Logvinenko. So I remember when you did this panel last year, you said that the economic outlook for Russia was very negative. It was predicted that the economy would worsen over time. So why hasn't this been the case?
There's a mic right here.
So, yeah. Well, you have such good memory, it's terrible. Predictions are difficult, especially about the future, as they say. But there's the economy isn't, I don't think it's looking great. I think it's just coming out of a recession. And Russia, like all other sort of semi-market economies, is prone to business cycles. And so it's coming into this kind of 1 to 2% growth trajectory. It isn't anything spectacular, and it's not anywhere close to being back to, at 1% growth, it would take it 4 or 5 years to be back at the levels of like 2013 or something like that. So I wouldn't call it a spectacular turnaround, but generally speaking, I mean, ahead of the elections, it's good to have economy to be a little bit on the upswing. What happened besides the business cycle? So the oil prices have kind of stabilized. So they've adjusted their budget expenditures, and I've said this in the panel the year before that. I mean, one of the kind of biggest mysteries of Russian policymaking to me under Putin was the incredible prudent financial management of the economy, and has been attributed to Alexei Kudrin, but even people after him, like, well, I guess Ulyukayev, who's now in prison, but they have managed the economy really well. They haven't been profligate spenders. They have been, Russian finance minister and central bankers have been named like the best finance ministers and central bankers over the years. And so they've done well. They have this rainy fund, they have a stabilization fund, you have to kind of give them credit for being ready for these kinds of external events like the lower oil prices. And then there's some argument, there's some debate about it, but some argument that the sanctions regime, which IMF estimates cost Russia about 1.5% of the GDP, has actually resulted in this kind of state protection, this kind of the reemergence of domestic industry. So the agriculture is doing really well, and various export industries. So this kind of state-led development model has kind of emerged in Russia, and then maybe that's accountable a little bit for the perking up of the economy. But I wouldn't call this sort of a great economic comeback,
As we sit here tonight, I gather that Russia and Belarus are having some massive military exercises and maneuvers on the soil of both countries, and there's some real fear that the Russian military is going to walk into and take over Belarus and make similar moves now or eventually for Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and maybe Poland. I sense this could happen just as they took over and just walked into the Crimea and got away with it. What's your thought on that? They're rebuilding the Soviet Empire. That's what.
Can you hear me? Yeah. This is not going to happen. Belarus is a Russia-friendly regime, and the Baltic states are NATO countries. They are not going to invade NATO countries, and they're certainly not going to invade Poland. I really don't think these things are going to happen. I think it's a way of showing the Kremlin showing its power and sort of intimidation tactics. Of course, the Kremlin is very much against the EU and wanting to do everything it can to weaken the European Union. It's very happy, of course, at all of the things that have been happening to weaken the European Union. But I think you can sleep soundly if you're a Latvian, Lithuanian, or Estonian, honestly. Now, I'm an historian, so we don't usually have to predict things. But I really think they're not going to really invade NATO countries. I think that would be insane. And they're very sound and intelligent people. Igor, what do you think?
I remember I came across this statistic that kind of blew me away. In the mid-1970s, at the height of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was at its most powerful, its economy accounted for something like 2/3 of the U.S. economy. That's the highest it got, okay? And so Russia today is maybe 10% of the U.S. economy. And, you know, those of us who study kind of international relations at this kind of systemic level, you have to account for distribution of capabilities in the system to some extent. I mean, that's not the exhaustive way of thinking about international politics, but there's just how can it restore the Soviet Empire going into Poland and the Baltics and the like, when you have 20% of the population living below poverty line and it's completely integrated into the global financial system, and it's basically existing as exporting various raw materials to the West. I mean, I just don't see it happening, and I think this kind of alarmism, if you pardon my choice of words, I mean, it's not terribly helpful to the folks in Central Eastern Europe, I don't think. So that would be my response to that.
So I worked at the House Foreign Affairs Committee over the summer, so we were kind of interested in this issue, and I know that we were worried about some of the cyber warfare that's going on that Russia's doing in Central and Eastern Europe and also the Baltic states. So my question for you all is, say if Russia keeps trying to interfere in elections, so for example, it tried to manipulate some of the voter results in Ukraine, like if it tries doing that like in Germany this fall or something, like should NATO consider that like an Article 5 violation, or how high should that bar be?
Well, of course Russia's going to interfere in the elections, and the Soviet Union and Russia has been trying to interfere and has been successfully interfering in elections for decades, and so have we. President Yeltsin would probably or possibly not have gotten reelected in 1996 had it not been for massive United States meddling in that election. So this is just part of what happens. Actually, the latest that I've read is that there seems to be surprisingly little Russian interference so far in the German elections, which is actually surprising. We have to wait and see, but we have to expect it. I mean, the issue is that, of course, the Russians are so darn good at all of this cyber stuff, and as far as some of us are concerned, we wish the brain drain would just go faster from there, and we could get some of those people. It's just all to be expected, and it's naive to be shocked that this kind of thing goes on, because it's always been going on. I just wanted to have a note, just say something about something entirely different, which is I actually talked to a number of people, and I've been reading quite a bit about it. Of course, Trump is now very unpopular in Russia, but what I've seen is a lot of sympathy for Trump supporters. A lot of people in Russia saying, the people who voted for Trump are just like us. A lot of them are men who drink too much and aren't well and have sort of and jobs that we don't feel we're respected, and we need to have our rightful place. And они мужики как мы. So I think it was kind of interesting that there's this divide between sort of Trump turned out to be deceitful and not what we expected, but we can really sympathize with all of those people. Because we probably would have voted for him too, because he was talking to us. Funny.
So from Osminkin to, I guess, this figure of grandfather Putin, what would you say is the, role of Russian youth currently, given the impending elections and just the general political climate?
Well, I can start by saying that, I don't know, one of the responses to the protests in the spring has been this huge number of, not even just university-age students, but high school students, people who have did not know another leader than Putin during the course of their lifetime. But I don't think that's an entirely different dynamic than during the protests of 2011, 2012. I think. No, those are much older people. Yeah, but I mean, it was certainly, there were older generations, yeah, and there was one element of concern. That we have a sense that like history will follow its course, and like the Soviet sort of rocks in people's heads will gradually sort of dissipate as generations seed, and then younger generations will bring a sort of more sort of global democratic perspective. And then there was a moment of worry, I think, around the time of Ukraine, that the sort of orthodox pro-party, pro-state education which is going on in schools, that there's going to be a sort of a reaction in this sort of more sort of conservative direction. And I guess the sort of protests of the spring have complicated that picture, but it's still very much complicated. I think we've seen sort of more grassroots mobilization in this country, and we're still deciding how it can manifest itself in sort of institutional directions. And the Russian opposition is not entirely organized or putting forth a coherent sort of picture of their sort of campaign for 2018.
Yeah. And actually, just kind of to bring around to the point that I was talking about, this sort of symbolic politics of the centennial of the revolution. If you look in the fall arts calendar that a lot of people saw, there was the photograph actually that relates to this panel, and it was taken in St. Petersburg, and it was a protest of young people protesting corruption, and they had a big banner with a portrait of Lenin, and it said, Lenin did it in 1917, we can do it too. So, we should be revolutionaries the way they were then. So it's coming around, full circle.
If you look at the cycles of government overthrows, revolutions, the color revolutions in the former Soviet area, overwhelmingly the leaders who came to power, who were successful, had previously served in the governments of the incumbents who they overthrew. So if you're looking for future leaders of the Russian state, aren't likely to come from outside of the regime. They're more likely to come from within it. So I would look at figures like, somebody like Medvedev, or somebody like the currently in prison Ulyukayev, than anybody like Navalny, or anybody more radical than that. Just seems to be the record in the region. The folks in the just general population seems to trust, even though they know everybody's corrupt, but you have to have been part of the corrupt system for them to trust you to run the government again for some reason.
What's your prediction about what's going to happen in Ukraine, especially in eastern Ukraine?
I have a slide about Ukraine just to show you one thing. So this was a Financial Times article that I saw a few days ago, and so while there's all of this, fight for the future of Ukraine and the removal of Lenin statues and all of this kind of stuff, over the course of the last 15 years, Russians have been developing routes to export their raw materials outside of Ukraine. So there's now two, northern pipelines that go through the Baltic Sea that can deliver Russian oil outside of Belarus or Ukraine. And there's now the Turkish Stream that I think is already completed or is about to be completed. Crimea figures prominently into it. They're building a railroad that kind of goes outside of the kind of eastern Ukraine. And so in the long term, you're seeing this kind of isolation of Ukraine outside of the greater European continent, basically. And I see that as a bigger issue than any other kind of immediate, politicking that's happening in Ukraine. But on the immediate short-term focus, things aren't looking great. I mean, the last I saw, the current president of Ukraine, Poroshenko, has an approval rating in single digits. We're looking at another round of, instability. Who knows who will be next to come to power. It's unpopular opinion, but some of the folks supporting the current regime in Ukraine have sympathies with the Nazi occupiers of that part of the world. And there's real danger of a serious breakdown in Ukraine. I mean, I'm hopeful that something will come around, but in the long term, as the conflict goes on, Ukraine is losing, regardless of who's in power there.
It's a failed state. I mean, it's on its way to becoming a failed state. It's on its way to becoming a failed state. Well, we always have a tradition of ending this panel on a really bleak note. So this looks like it. Adam, if you don't mind, I think maybe it's time we're going to wind up.
Sure.
So thank you very much for coming, and I hope to see you here at other events. Yeah.